Hi everyone, good evening. We're just waiting for some headsets to be delivered for the interpretation, so if you'll bear with us, we'll be ready in 2-3 minutes. Thank you. Okay, hello everybody, good evening. It's a real pleasure to welcome you here tonight to the joint event on making effective progress in adaptation from project to national and global levels. I know this is a late slot, I know it's been a long day, but we will do our best to justify the time investment with a rich kind of intellectual diet. So just to start, I'm Michael Mullen from OECD. I'm going to give a framing presentation based on work from my colleagues, which is really looking at measuring progress at the national level. So I think this is not going to be a surprise to anyone here, but the point is that we are in a new era on adaptation in terms of the politics, in terms of the science, and in terms of what we're seeing with our own eyes. It's moved from this is something we need to think about in the future to this is something that's happening today and we need to respond to. What that means is we need to do more, but we also need to make sure that our efforts are effective. And this is where the vital importance of monitoring evaluation, measuring progress comes in, and this is the purpose of this evening's discussion. So, good, you can see the slides, fantastic. This is a very simple and very familiar diagram, but hopefully also one that explains some of the challenges that we face. What we care about is managing the climate impacts on human health, on well-being, on ecosystems, etc. Meanwhile, that's being driven by trends in vulnerability, exposure, hazard, much of which is exogenous, driven by a whole bunch of factors, of which deliberate adaptation interventions are only one. So what do we need to measure and what do we want to measure? Okay, inputs, how much money is being put in, what kind of policy efforts are being made, outputs, what's actually happening in the real world. The medium-term outcomes, but also in the longer term, what are the policy impacts? Not just does this look good today, but is this driving a change that makes sense given the range of possible climate futures that we face? Now, what we're seeing amongst the OECD countries is there's been a huge explosion in adaptation planning. Now all OECD countries have a national adaptation plan. However, we're at an earlier stage in assessing the progress being made through those plans. Currently, only half of OECD countries have developed progress or evaluation reports. Why? So we did a survey of our membership to see what are some of the main barriers. I think it's worth emphasizing, so these are the issues that are quite or very challenging to address. All of them were viewed as challenges. No one said they weren't challenges at all. This is just a question of how challenging. And we see the top three: measuring effectiveness, lack of data, and complexity of adaptation. We're very much looking forward to getting the insights today on tackling some of these challenges. And just before I wrap up, we'll have a publication on this coming out next year, but just to highlight some of the initial messages, we see 4 priorities for action. The first is having a clear vision. If you don't know where you're trying to get to, you'll never be able to assess if you've got there. So in that sense, the measuring success starts at the planning stage. Secondly, strengthening accountability and strengthening mechanisms for accountability. Thirdly, facilitating frequent exchanges between stakeholders. Often it's very much a government, public sector-led process, but what we know is that successful adaptation requires efforts across the whole of society, across the private sector, civil society, communities, etc. All of these actors need to be involved in the discussion about A, what is success, and B, how do you measure progress towards it? And of course, not everything that counts can be counted, and so it's not just about indicators. Indicators are an important part of the story, but really it's about bringing together evidence from different sources to getting a comprehensive picture of where things stand. So here's some contact details from my colleagues, and with that I will give the word to Lola. Lola, please.
Thank you. I'm Lola Valéjo, the Director of Climate at IDDRI. I'm going to speak today about some work that we have done on the Global Adaptation Progress Tracker. So Michael has presented basically where OECD countries stand. And in the context of international adaptation, we know that many countries do not have the resources or governance arrangements in place to be at the same stage of adaptation planning, but yet it's very important to have a global picture of where we stand on the global goal on adaptation, and it's, by the way, something that we discuss a lot in the context of this COP. We'll come back to that in the discussion. We decided at IDDRI to have a simple framework organized around 6 key questions, which are now shown in this beautiful flower, to try to sidestep some of the common issues we have with adaptation assessment, seeing we need indicators which are always the same and we need to find data. And here we're more thinking, how can we rely on expert judgment to make sense of the information we have, and also to deal with cases where maybe we don't have all the data and information that we would like to have. So, these questions you can see are knowledge of risk. Do they have plans in place? Are there actions in place? What can you say about risk reduction? And do you have a dynamic approach? So do you kind of revise your adaptation policy over time? And we're also not looking at just country level, but thought actually countries meet a lot of common challenges, and having this framework approach about these key 6 pillars is a way to find the similarities among countries' approaches. In the first phase of this project, we have applied it on one hazard, so the management of coasts in the context of climate change. And we applied it to 2 different countries, one being Senegal, the other Mauritius, to try and come out with outputs and findings and see how that could be applied in practice. So that was just the first phase to kind of get us started. I won't get into the detail. You have a full report about what these means, but you already have some interesting findings that come from these and that have been used in the countries where we had implemented them. So Senegal and Mauritius are now using this framework to inform their adaptation planning. We're now in the middle of the next phase, which is if we want to say something about adaptation at the global scale, how do we cut the pie? We know that there are loads of risks, but based on our understanding of the IPCC reports, we've narrowed it down to some of the key systems which seemed most at risk, either socio-geographical systems, so coasts, mountains, rural systems, for instance, or key sectors like health, food security, infrastructure and energy system, just to try and identify what could be some of the main adaptation priorities. And I think that's a conversation that's very relevant in the context of this COP and discussion on the global goal on adaptation. And we really try to have a framework that we can apply at different scales. So we had applied it at the national scale, but we think that this approach can also be useful to inform the international discussion. To try and apply this framework at the global scale, we kind of do a bit of back and forth between the local, the regional, and the global. So for coast, we kind of split the world in 7 regions, decided on some case studies which were important for specific archetypes, to try and use the anecdotal in a way to be able to say something about the global. And I think that's one of the key methodological challenges that we face right now when considering adaptation progress. So just to give you a final information about next step, we'll have this first global adaptation evaluation of coasts ready before the end of the Global Stocktake, so probably in the beginning of next year. And we would like to also work with other initiative and other adaptation efforts, not only the national country reports, but also a range of other big reports that are going to input in the Global Stocktake on adaptation. What would be great, of course, would be to replicate this analysis every few years so that we could compare progress over time, and you would see the different bars, of course, being at different levels. I think one important takeaway is that it's not just about indicators and data, and even though you have a fancy graph at the end, it's also about the sense, the meaning that you put behind that, and connecting with local experts that also know about the particular sectoral priorities. So this is what we've tried to achieve. I'll pass the word to my colleague Sven.
So thank you, Lola. Thank you, Michael. So I'm coming a bit from a different perspective, which is the perspective of a bilateral donor. As you'll guess from my accent, it's Germany. I work at a federal independent evaluation institute, which means that our mandate is to contribute to transparency about Germany's ODA spending. And as part of that, we looked at what Germany has been doing in the space of climate change adaptation, a rather large study or evaluation, I would say, which started in 2018. And there's a plane coming, great. And will be completed next year. So before I get to the juicy bits, some nice findings from the evaluation. So first of all, we found that Germany complied more or less with its strategy, how much they wanted to spend on climate change adaptation. You see the figures over there, and seeing that Germany is a relatively significant donor in that space. More in terms of what works and what doesn't work, we found that nature-based solutions and infrastructure were the most successful in adaptation, especially when combined with sort of knowledge management measures. But for us, this evaluation really was a challenge because one of our tasks was to respond back to the ministry. What do we really know about adaptation finance? And as we heard yesterday in the high-level speeches from Oxfam, there is a lack of transparency of what is being reported. We have problems of not an agreed standard. Data quality, particularly for us, looking at how it was reported in the German system, was challenging, and that limited also the extent to which we can compare Germany's adaptation spending to other donors. And you see the quotes there from relevant literature. They've been writing quite a bit about this. So then here's an interesting bit, actually, I find personally. So what we did, actually, we used AI, specifically text mining, and analyzed project documents from Germany to sort of come up with an alternative classification on adaptation. Not so much an alternative classification, but trying to use AI to spot adaptation interventions. And we did this iteratively, and we basically replicated some work that is done by CARE, but CARE did it on quite a small sample. This is still work in progress, but it shows that there might be a problem in the German reporting. So across the board, even though it's getting a bit better, but we see a range between, let's say, 25, 35, 40% of over-reporting on adaptation spending. Yeah, quite a big number. Curious how this will turn out in the end. Again, we do see a trend, that's one. Second, what I should mention also, this is only ODA spend, right? And so for official climate financing, also non-ODA funds are counted. So you can't directly compare those numbers here with the numbers that are sort of presented here at the COP, because there are some other interventions that go in there. But just at looking at development cooperation, looking at Germany only, there seems to be a problem in terms of the reporting, which is basically related to the lack of guidelines and so on. So, from our side for bilateral donor, what is needed? As Michael already mentioned, it starts with the design phase. So we looked at also the design of adaptation interventions, and we saw that risk assessments and mainstreaming of adaptation still can be improved, especially in those projects which are in vulnerable countries, but which are not marked as adaptation, but may be relevant to adaptation. There we see only that a quarter of those projects do actually good systematic risk assessments. So in the adaptation marked projects, you have the risk assessment and everything, right? But in the same country, which is vulnerable, you may have an infrastructure project which is not labeled as adaptation. You may want to do a risk assessment, right? And that's only done in a quarter of the cases. Data quality, I already mentioned. Another point, looking at the German M&E system of development cooperation, we found that from those around about 200 indicators which were used, only 30% are really appropriate to measure adaptation. So there's some work on the monitoring side as well. And we do the meta evaluation on evaluations in the German system, and only 16% really produced, plausible, credible evidence. But then again, I think also this is something Michael touched upon and Lola, and what we will hear from the other panelists. Measuring adaptation is probably not enough, right? There's also the question on how do we integrate other cross-cutting issues like conflict, gender, human rights, and then also specifically, I guess, in the adaptation space, we found in the German system there's a real need to create a space for innovation, to take more risk and try things out. Okay, with that, I'm done. Those are some of the publications that we put out there so far. Here's my email if you want to criticize what I've said or ask questions. And there we go. And then hand over to Lola for the panelists.
Thank you very much. If you want to criticize, I would encourage everyone to keep your questions for the end. I'll introduce the panelists, ask them a couple of questions, and then we're really happy tonight to have Dr. Young, the Chief Research Fellow of the Adaptation Center of Climate Change in Korea. Also, Mr. Joseph Škulteti, the Director of Climate Change Policy Department at the Ministry of Environment of Slovakia. And Mr. Alejandro Eduarte, the President of the National Commission for Risk Prevention and Emergency Response in Costa Rica. Maybe before asking the question, let's remind ourselves we are talking about assessing adaptation, not just because we like to get into the nitty-gritty, but because we want to do better adaptation. So let's always remember that this is why we're talking about this topic that you may find fascinating or not. But anyway, it's about thinking where could we put our money and how could we better design adaptation policies. With that in mind, I would like to ask our panelists maybe to reflect on their national experiences, on how do you assess progress on adaptation in your different countries, and maybe also what information you think you may still need to find to improve decision making. Do you have everything you need, or would you need something else? So maybe, yeah, Mr. Young?
Okay, thank you very much, Chair. Well, actually, I received 3 questions, but she asked me about the first question and 2 questions together. So I'd like to tell you what I prepared for those 2 questions. Okay, regarding the first questions, in practice, in Korea, we make the national adaptation plan and the sub-national adaptation plans established every 5 years, and there's a monitoring and evaluation system process for both national and sub-national level of adaptation plan. But for the national adaptation plan, there are 3 kinds of evaluation process, including annual evaluation, midterm evaluation, and comprehensive evaluations. 3 types of evaluations are available for those in the adaptation plan. But in the evaluation, we use the indicators, and we use the indicators for assess the adaptation actions. And these indicators include the securing budget execution rate, and level of implementation, and policy effectiveness. Those are the kind of indicators we use for the assessment of the progress. But actually, those indicators come up with a quantitative and qualitative shape. But by using those the indicators, I think we are good at tracking the action implementation. But in somehow we are not so good for the tracking the performance of the plan, because most of the indicators were developed to check up the implementation of the plans, but it's not good. It's not sufficient for checking the performance, because sometimes it's very hard to check up the performance of the plan. But that's the kind of ultimate goal for the measuring progress, I guess. And also, the government make the kind of guidance for the evaluation of the action. And currently, we recognize the need for the evaluation of the performance with the quantitative indicators. Because usually we hire the qualitative the indicators, but those are the kind of thing that dealt by the expert judgment something. But this is not the kind of thing that just apply to the everything equally. So now we are concerned about the development of the indicators for the quantitative. And if I add some more to the question related to the what type and the level of information or adaptation approach, well, at here I'd like to tell you something, because it is necessary to have accurate risk assessment and set goals based on climate change risk assessment is very important, because every the country make their adaptation plan. And also, when they are making the adaptation plan, they implement the risk assessment. But sometimes this risk assessment is being done by the survey of the expert. So, but at any type of the risk assessment, there's kind of rule that those risk assessment has to be done based on the hazard, exposure, and vulnerability, which was suggested by the IPCC annual report 5. So if you are just keep in your mind for those principles, then risk assessment is not that difficult. But the problem is setting the goal is a kind of real matter. So for example, if we compare the adaptation to the mitigation obviously they have the kind of goal to achieve. But in the adaptation, it's not easy to make set the goal, and also we just do our adaptation. Let's say that in the future we have more rain and we have more possibility to have the flood. This is only the reason that why we are making a kind of plans to prevent the flood. But at here, without the goal, so we just do our adaptation, the action itself. But if we just consider how much of the reduce the flooding area compared to a certain year, or if we make the kind of the cost for the loss, like let's say the $1 million or $2 million, if we set the goal like that, like the quantitative the way, then it's easier for us to make the kind of a plan. But setting goal is not that easy. So later on, we need to put our efforts to setting the goal quantitatively. Well, I think that's good enough for your question. And if I have more time, I will add some more. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Mr. Skulteti?
Thank you very much. Firstly, I would like to thank for inviting me to attend this event and to provide you some information about our national policy related to adaptation to the impact of climate change, and also to present some ideas how we can move for the future and what we are planning to do. Concerning national adaptation policy in Slovakia, I can underline the fact that in 2018 our Slovak government adopted revised national adaptation strategy, which in principle set up the main areas of interest where our adaptation action has to come. And last year, in the end of August, Slovak government approved the National Adaptation Action Plan, which is in principle implementation tool of national strategy, which I had mentioned previously. This National Adaptation Plan has several tasks which cover the areas defined in national adaptation strategies with concrete timing, with concrete subtasks and measures which have to be implemented, and they are linked also to the indicators for the measurement of the success of their implementation. Once talking about the indicators, obviously we have to keep in mind that we have to follow the progress of implementation itself on one side, and also the possibility to properly assess the success concerning the adaptation outcomes we would like to achieve. This basic structure concerning the policy documents help us using also proper coordination method and tools and procedures to go further, following the vertical line of administration from national level to regional level. I mean now regional level concerning the regions which are substructure of national policy, and to provide there also proper actions to identify the adaptation needs and adaptation policies, and assist to develop the tools and the actions which could be implemented also under the management of either regional structures or local structures. This is very important because of collecting feedback, and this means collecting knowledge and information and data coming from the local level through regional level to national level, because here we are also for discussing how to pass from national level to the global level, to the international level, and what we can bring from national level to the international level, and what we can see and absorb and use deriving from international level to our national approaches. This is one line of the thinking and the ideas I wanted to share with you, and the other one is coming from the simple fact that Slovakia is member country of European Union and is also member country of European Environmental Agency. This means we are following legal and regulatory framework of European Union, where for us concerning the information and reporting, and this is something which is very closely linked to the knowledge, to the information, to the data. We are following the legal pieces of European Union. We have special legal piece which is called regulation related to energy union governance, and there is defined the obligation for each member country of European Union to provide adaptation reporting. And this adaptation reporting, this adaptation report is very precisely defined. The content of the adaptation report from the point of view of structure and the extent and the content of each basket, like a substructure of the report concerning the information, is precisely defined in the annex of this legal piece. This means we have quite proper vision what we have to report, and this means we have quite proper vision where we have to find an information or how to look for the information they are needed for the fulfillment of this obligation. One question definitely is what to do, what we have to find. The other question is how we can this find. This means how to work with information sources, what we have to do concerning the capacities, human resources, costs, and financial resources in principle in more general terms for digging out this information, collecting, analyze, aggregate information, and what we have to do with this once we collect this information and put into the report. What we have to do not only because of simple reporting requirements, but also what we have to do with the data and knowledge and information we have in our hands for the future planning, for improvement of our adaptation policy. Now we are starting the procedures for preparing the new adaptation strategy, which we have to provide for the governmental approval in 2 years. It looks this is quite long period, but this is not the fact that in 2 years we can do it very simply, because we would like really to improve the adaptation strategy in the new version. We would like to bring there also the knowledge we can collect during this COP as the global international event, using also the sides events, not only the formal decisions coming from COP, but also the sides events as this one is. That's why I would like also to thank for the presentation we could see a few minutes ago, because I am convinced that we will find within your institutions we will find a lot of wisdom and a lot of knowledge which could be applicable also in our future work. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Now I'll pass the floor to Alejandro Duarte, who will answer in Spanish. So if you don't speak Spanish, make sure you have a headset. ¿Quiere que repito la pregunta en español?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm going to have my presentation in Spanish because the language is more technical, okay? If somebody needs Okay, Costa Rica es un país que tiene un plan de adaptación aprobado en este año precisamente, pero que tiene más de 40 años de reportar daños y pérdidas por los efectos del cambio climático, y eso nos pone a reflexionar precisamente sobre el trabajo que tenemos que hacer ahora, en este momento como países, para revisar los daños y la cuantificación de las pérdidas en relación con el cambio climático, y la necesidad de que los cooperantes, los países y también los fondos que tenemos relacionados al cambio climático empiecen a tomar un rumbo distinto, más orientado a las necesidades específicas de cada país. A pesar del plan que tenemos y de los indicadores que tenemos para medir, coincido en que eso no es suficiente para enfrentar las condiciones del cambio climático. Como presidente de la Comisión Nacional de Atención de Emergencias de Costa Rica, quiero contarles que somos nosotros los que recogemos las víctimas producto de las inundaciones y de los efectos del cambio climático. Y esas personas que año tras año pierden sus hogares o pierden todos sus elementos en sus hogares, y la pérdida también de vidas humanas, son en los que tenemos que enfocarnos como países para que los resultados que están en los planes de adaptación al cambio climático puedan verse reflejados. Ese es el nivel de impacto que tenemos que buscar nosotros a nivel de nuestros países. ¿Por qué? Porque el papel y los planes aguantan lo que ustedes... ¿Me espero? Okay. I'm going to wait.
No, todo bien.
¿Todo bien?
Sí, sí, sí.
Ok. Costa Rica es un país que está apostando por un cambio de mentalidad. Estamos apostando a dejar de esperar la asistencia humanitaria y de enfocarnos en atender el cambio climático de una manera preventiva, haciendo inversión y buscando la cooperación para atender la infraestructura que está poniendo en peligro a las personas. Y hemos accedido en los últimos meses al trámite de un crédito por $700 millones para recuperar infraestructura de vivienda, infraestructura educativa, infraestructura ferroviaria, infraestructura de puentes y caminos. Pero queremos que este ejercicio sea reconocido por los cooperantes también, y que vean que como país, a pesar de ser un país pequeño que sufre los mismos embates del resto de los países centroamericanos, estamos haciendo un esfuerzo importante por ir adelante del desastre y no atrás. No podemos seguir siendo reactivos, así que las herramientas que tenemos en cuanto a la adaptación nos hacen pensar si necesariamente tenemos que adaptarnos al cambio climático, que es una situación muy compleja para nosotros, porque significa que ya no hay absolutamente nada que hacer. Creemos que sí podemos hacer todavía mucho, y parte de lo que podemos hacer precisamente está en ir delante del desastre, haciendo una evaluación constante de las acciones que podemos hacer antes y no después. Creo que esa es una tarea que no solo, como lo dije, las autoridades de gobierno, a través de la unión de todas las instituciones, podemos hacer, sino que tenemos que lograr que los cooperantes y los diferentes fondos que están relacionados con el cambio climático también comprendan que las necesidades de los países que nos vemos afectados por el cambio climático van en otra dimensión, y no en la dimensión del asistencialismo, sino en la dimensión de que nos ayuden a enfrentar, antes de que sucedan las cosas, lo que nos está afectando directamente. Nada hacemos con continuar generando planes e iniciativas que están orientadas precisamente a que las personas año tras año tengan que estar sufriendo los mismos embates de la naturaleza. La línea que estamos trabajando y que queremos trabajar en los años futuros a nivel de Centroamérica y de nuestro país está orientada precisamente a eso. Muchas gracias por el espacio y con muchísimo gusto las consultas que tengan.
Thank you very much for all these contrasting and complementary speeches about the state of adaptation, planning and evaluation in your respective countries. I think I would like to maybe also continue on the point that you had made about this question of losses and damages is of course very discussed at this COP. But there are also other processes which are really about trying to be more specific about what adaptation is about. One is a work program to try and define also what is the global goal on adaptation, so try and spell out how could we make the global goal on adaptation more action-oriented and more effective. And another one which is the Global Stocktake, where we take stock of our action on adaptation, among other things, to, again, improve future adaptation planning and future adaptation plans. So with that in mind, if we wanted to make progress in those international discussions, can you think of specific tools, methodology, or technical support, or any kind of support that would be needed to support your national efforts? Do you want to go? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Chair. Okay, you raised a question like the kind of technical support or methods would be needed to help evaluate our progress. And here, I actually prepared a little bit different from this question, but I think this will be my answer for question. Before I go for the answer for the question 3, I'd like to tell you something. How do we make the climate change adaptation plan? Actually, the climate change adaptation plan implemented in the order of risk assessment and the goal setting, and the plan establishment and plan implementation. This is my personal opinion, so I think yours will be different from mine. But the risk assessment is very important step in the beginning, and the setting goal. Before, actually, I insist that the setting goal is very important. So still, I believe that the setting of the goal is important. By the goal setting is somewhat different from the global goal of adaptation. Sometimes the global level of the goal come up with a kind of a very qualitative, kind of a symbolic remarks we can hear. But my goal setting is very kind of a quantitative. For example, for the reduce the possibility of the flood, like 50% reduction compared to the this year the whatever specific time. Sometimes this is not kind of a realistic, but we need to think about the those goals as a very quantitative manner. So this is something that I think about that. In this context, for what among those 4 the steps, including risk assessment, goal setting, and plan establishment and plan implementation, I think we are still very weak in the goal setting and the assessment of the implementation. So first of all, when we think about the goal itself, this goal setting can be used for the planning, and also this goal setting can be used for the evaluation. So once we make the goal, then it can be used very diverse the use. And also, to make the goal setting, we need to have the kind of indicators to explain about the goals. So this is the thing that I can tell you about the answer for the technical support and method. And second one is the monitoring. Monitoring is very also important in process of evaluation. So indicators are needed for proper monitoring, and works such as investigation and analysis based on these indicators is very necessary. So usually when you're thinking about the assessment, this monitoring come along with the assessment. So this is why we call it as the monitoring and evaluation. Without the monitoring, I think it's very hard to make the assessment. Assessment is a kind of action with the gathered monitoring data of the results. So I'd like to tell you about we need to develop a kind of technical way of the collecting those the data through the monitoring. So collecting, doing the monitoring and the development of the evaluation method is a kind of a development of the way that development of framework for monitoring with indicators, I can tell. So data collected from the monitoring can be used not only as base data for the performance evaluation, but also as basic data for establishment of the next adaptation plan. So my question can be simplified that development of the goal setting, the way of goal setting, and the monitoring method will be the kind of thing that we need for technical support and the method.
Thank you very much. I'd like pass the floor to Mr. Shukultedi.
Thank you. Maybe I will bring a little bit different angle of view.
Sorry, do you mind speaking in front of the microphone, because there are planes every other minute?
I will try to.
Thank you.
To be more precise also in the term of my sound. Well, maybe we can see this global goal of adaptation and negotiations and losses damages from a little bit different perspective once we are talking about the national plans and our national planning and the processes which are linked to that. Speaking about the simple liaison between national plans and activities and policies and the global policies ones, because adaptation is something which is really very close to real life on spot in the communities, in the cities, in urban area, in small villages. Once we are seeing this from the perspective of the country, quite small country, which is in the middle of Europe, like Slovakia is, and the effect of huge natural disasters which are really affecting drastically and dramatically the other part of the world is not so visible in our country. However, although now is quite obvious that climate change is coming, the real climate crisis, there are still a lot of people which are not affected by the direct impacts which are so drastic in our country. Anyway, they are already confronted with some heat waves, for instance, in the cities, with some incoming droughts, with some huge precipitations, for instance, with some negative effects which are causing for them bad feeling, and this everything somehow helps us to identify also the necessity for orientation of national policy also to certain promotion of the measures, to certain tools for increasing public awareness, to the orientation of the national policy, national adaptation policy or climate policy, to bring it more closely to the inhabitants, to the population. And when I bringing this to the question, what tools are required or what we are expecting concerning the tools and support, the first one, according my perception, is to have political support. Political support, which is really inevitable for bringing not only the state administration or public administration as the engine to the proper movement towards to achieving required goals, but also to bringing the interest of politicians and state administration on the interest of each stakeholder, which is important from various perspectives, to bring them to as close as possible to real life of inhabitants. And for this, what is important is to have quite sophisticated structure of capacities and identified proper sources, human sources, financial sources, coordination schemes, because adaptation is something what is affecting horizontal level of administration or horizontal vertical level of administration, and this very complex problem has to be somehow addressed, and for this really we need quite sophisticated, elaborated or absorbed from the experience, from lesson learned from abroad, the expertise needed for proper addressing of all these issues. This is what is linked to political support and administrative support and financial support. Obviously, technical support is a must, mainly concerning the data processing, and the question how to deal with this is open and has to be elaborated. The solutions have to be elaborated really with smart approach. What is not so simple, what is not free of charge. Anyway, we have to deal with this because otherwise we can really lose the opportunity, we can lose the momentum for action now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Señor Duarte.
Muchas gracias. Alejandro Picado es mi nombre.
Alejandro Ricardo.
Sí, gracias.
Eduardo.
Ok, bueno, estoy totalmente de acuerdo con los panelistas pero yo creo que estamos acostumbrados a ver que los planes llevan normalmente estos componentes. Lleva componentes de una buena definición de indicadores, buena definición de objetivos, una persona que se haga cargo del seguimiento o un grupo, una autoridad que se haga cargo del seguimiento de los planes. Me parece a mí que a la pregunta que hace a la panelista acá, lo más importante que podemos nosotros incorporar como una oportunidad de mejora es un indicador que pueda medir el impacto real que tiene el plan que estamos generando en los diferentes territorios y a nivel nacional. Si nosotros no tenemos la capacidad de incorporar algún tipo de indicador que genere o que permita medir el impacto real y el cambio sustantivo que se pueda ver a nivel de resultados, creo que nos quedaremos nuevamente, como ya lo hemos establecido, muchos planes. Tenemos muchos planes a nivel global y planes en las diferentes naciones de nuestros países, pero el gran reto, insisto, está en definir y establecer los indicadores de impacto real que podamos tener a partir de estos planes y la definición de los objetivos, y por supuesto podemos hacer una revisión de los objetivos que se han venido planteando en los planes de adaptación de nuestras naciones. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Señor Picado. I would like now to maybe open the floor to any question from the room. And if there's no question from the room, maybe ask everyone to have one final. Just see if there are any others. If there are no questions from the, I don't know, is someone hesitating? Come on, don't be shy, don't be shy. We're amongst ourselves, come on.
Hey, sorry about my English. So you talk about the national scope, but are you talking also about the municipality scope,
sorry, the what?
like the cities?
Yeah.
It's in, can you tell us more about it? Because we couldn't see different because of the scope. But did you measure it? And can you, well, to tell more about it? So.
Thank you. I don't know. I'm just turning around to see if anyone from the panel has worked on resilience and adaptation planning at the CIST level. Maybe Mr. Skulteti, you talked about different scales?
Yes, we did it a lot with cities that we are still doing, and we will be doing even more. What is nice is that on the level of cities in Slovakia, we can recognize sometimes even a bigger interest related to adaptation planning and adaptation measures, adaptation actions than in the other areas which normally are identified as really the areas of interest for adaptation policies. And urban policies are important for the management of cities, for city councils, also because of the simple fact they are the voters which are affected by their policies, and these voters are closer to the city municipality management and city council than to the national government. Well, they are plus the people from the municipality, the administrator from the municipality, the mayors, they are living with inhabitants in these cities. They are meeting them obviously during the day very often. They are walking on corridors of the buildings. They are walking on trottoirs. They are meeting them. In principle, they are confronted with their feedback very, very often. And for this purpose, we see that this interest to address climate change problems are very often smart and realized with certain wisdom and with certain goodwill to bring the positive solutions. One problem is that very often these experts working for municipalities, they are keen to do something for designing, for instance, local action plans or local adaptation strategies, but they don't know how to do it. They don't know where to find the proper source of information, the knowledge, where to find the parallels which could be replicable on the level of their cities, and that's why very often they are looking for the solutions somewhere when it could be quite not so easily transferable to their municipalities. But this we would like also this problem in Slovakia we would like to overcome with the elaborating of certain methodologies which could be applicable for the cities in certain with certain number of inhabitants and replicable in principle many times, with our support also from the position of Ministry of Environment, with the support of experts and consultancy companies. They already elaborated such municipalities' action plans. For this now we are launching quite huge project which has several components concerning the methodologies and adaptation methodologies for various areas of interest related to adaptation policy, and one of these components is a methodology for municipal and regional local action plans.
Thank you. Yes, yes.
Yeah, I'd like to add some a little bit more. So I understand that your question is in making the resilience in the city level. So I think this is what the adaptation plans for, because we make the adaptation plan for a very diverse purpose, but making the having the resilience is, I think, one of the representing the goal for the establishment of the adaptation plan. But sometimes adaptation plan, making the adaptation plan is not easy, because sometimes we make some mistake. Once we make the mistake, then we go for the maladaptation. It means that we just waste our time and money and etc. So before we go for the adaptation plan, at the initiation of the adaptation planning process, we go for the risk assessment, right? So at here, you need to get some kind of scientific evidence or the scientific tool for the estimating the future, the hazard, or the future, the risk. We call this kind of action as the impact assessment, or vulnerability assessment, the risk assessment, whatever. Anyway, this is a kind of stage that we are thinking of the future, hazard. Based on this kind of action, the behavior, we collect some of the scientific evidence. Based on the scientific evidence, it actually makes you give you the more opportunity to having the better the solution. I think this is the kind of the way to get the resilience. So resilience should be answered based on the scientific evidence of the actions. This is my thinking. Thanks.
Thank you.
And just to kind of briefly complement that answer. So look, in 2008 or 2009, I was working in the UK government on the development of the UK's first national adaptation programme. And at that time, one of the bits that we had, which I thought was quite interesting, was using measurement as a way of driving adaptation action at the local level. So there was the so-called National Indicator 188, which was a qualitative indicator for local authorities where they would be scored based on their progress in planning for adaptation. And we found that was quite helpful, because in a way, it was not like a strong policy instrument, but still, it got local authorities thinking about it and provided the first step along the road to taking adaptation action. Now, more recently at OECD, we've just finished a project with the government of Hungary working specifically on the question of implementing nature-based solutions at the local level.
You said nature-based solution?
Exactly, yeah.
Because it's faster in the cities. That's what you mean?
I mean, we think it's good everywhere, but it's particularly useful at the urban level. And one of the things we found there was also that sometimes the performance frameworks in place did not recognize the benefits of using nature-based solutions. So it's not necessarily a question of we need a new framework for adaptation, but rather how do we look at our existing frameworks and is it conducive to an adaptation response? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe I'll just ask everyone. Are there more questions from the room? No? Yeah? Okay.
Hello, thank you. Sorry about my English. You talked about measurement you have and you
Can you speak more loud, please?
measure with them.
Thank you.
Do you think about measure that you miss, like you want to, that there is no now and you want to develop measurement? New measurement?
Yeah, the question is, are there some new kinds of measurements that you do not have right now and that you think should exist? I mean, for IDDRI, we started answering that question in the presentation. We think you need to acknowledge that not just quantitative indicator, but also putting it in perspective through a group of experts coming together is useful, but I would let other panelists respond. Yeah?
Yeah. So our challenge is that we look at lots of countries usually, right? So one thing that we're playing with is using satellite data to do flood risk modeling to understand whether German projects are in flood risk areas. So that's an area sort of that we are sort of working on satellite data and flood modeling. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yeah, do you want to?
As far as Slovakia is concerned, the data we are collecting mainly from the climate data we are collecting mainly from Slovak Hydrometeorological Institute. Definitely this institute has its plan concerning the future technical improvement concerning the data with identification, collection and assessment and processing. However, in this moment it's quite premature to say what could be really in place in incoming years, because it depends obviously of the availability of the technical means and with this of availability of financial resources.
Thank you. Mr. Young, you wanted to say?
Excuse me, gentlemen. I just understood that your question is regarding new measurement for the evaluation. Well, if your question is somewhat similar to new measurement for evaluation, then I can answer you like this. Because I think, for example, from our experience in my country, Korea, we've been implementing the adaptation plan for more than 10 years so far. I think this is the kind of a little bit longer history compared to other countries, but still, we only have the 10 years, 12 years the experience. So I think we are still in the stage of the development of the methodology for the evaluation. So still we need to go further, but as I mentioned before, making the indicators for the evaluation is kind of urgent thing. Because in the unlike the mitigation area, adaptation, we have so many diverse areas. So it's very difficult and sometimes it's impossible to make an evaluation for different the adaptation plans. So in order to make it better, we need to develop proper indicators for the evaluation first. After we develop the indicators, and we also can continuously think about the methodology, which is how do we utilize those indicators. This is what I'm thinking about your question.
Thank you very much. Mr. Picado?
Sí, bueno, desde el punto de vista de nuestro país, Costa Rica, les decía el reto de la revisión de los objetivos planteados en la política, pero también creo que falta capacitar personas para el seguimiento y la medición del plan nacional y también, por supuesto, para los ejercicios que se vayan a hacer orientados a medir los verdaderos impactos del plan nacional de adaptación. Y esto creo que es el cambio que nosotros estaríamos sugiriendo a la política que actualmente tenemos vigente. Gracias.
Thanks for underlining the capacity question. I just want to check if there are any other question from the room. And if not, maybe if I could ask if you have any final word or any hope or wish for this, coming week of negotiation on adaptation. If you think some of the outputs could be interesting for the international discussion on the global goal, for instance, do you have some thoughts?
Well, it's quite simple. My hope, my wish is that my hope and my wish is that the negotiations will come to the outcomes which would be acceptable for all parties, which would bring the real benefit, although quite impossible to bring the real benefits from one day to the other one, but to have a really good set of decisions related to adaptation, which will positively affect the future process of UNFCCC, of Paris Agreement, and future adaptation actions everywhere in the world.
Well, if no one has any other comments, I would just like to thank really deeply our great panelists from Slovakia, Korea, and Costa Rica for sharing their fantastic experiences, as well as my OECD and Deval colleagues for organizing this event. Thank you very much for your time, and have a great evening.